to connect the two issues together. First of all, I would like to start with some historical perspective before trying to think together what might be the connection between what seems to be an unconditional, uncritical support of the Taiwanese government to the State of Israel and the genuine challenges Taiwan faces for its own future and existence. Before doing that, I think we need some sort of historical context to explain how we got to the moment that we are in today, and especially in the last 3 years. It really begins with the idea of Zionism as it appeared on the international map at the late 19th century. Zionism was born by two impulses to begin with. One was a wish to deal with an acute problem that most Europeans in the late 19th century called the Jewish question. The Jewish question was a sense among European politicians, intellectuals, societies, almost across the board in the continent, the European continent as a whole, that the future of the Jews in Europe in the late 19th century is problematic. It was not the case in every place in Europe, but in very important parts of the continent. This was the nature of the Jewish question. Are the Jews really integral, organic, legitimate part of the European societies? And we have to remember we're talking at an age when European people discovered, so to speak, nationalism. So there was a strong sense of belonging to nations compared to a century before that. People felt that they are part of the Polish nation, the German nation, the Italian nation, and so on. And maybe this is the problem with nationalism in general, that as much as it allows you to define clearly who you are, the best way to know who you are is to know who you are not. It seems to me that most nationalist movements, with some exceptions, no doubt, but mostly nationalist movement needs the other, the one that is not part of nationalism. So if you wanted to know who is the real Polish person, he could not be Jewish. He had to be Christian, Catholic, but definitely not Jewish. And a similar kind of definition or similar connection between Judaism and new national identities in Europe occurred elsewhere. So the Jewish communities felt that after, in a way, getting rid of what we used to call classical anti-Semitism, that is racism towards Jews that was based on Christianity, with the allegation that the Jews were responsible for the murder of Jesus Christ. This was now replaced by a modern version that the Jews are a different nation, are a different race, and cannot be really regarded as pure Europeans. So one impulse of Zionism was to deal with this issue. Now, quite a lot of Jews, in fact, the majority, thought that the best way to deal with it is to join movements that were more internationalist in their nature, such as socialism, communism. Others thought that maybe strengthening liberalism and democracy in their own countries would help to challenge racism. Very Orthodox Jews thought that there's very little they can do because they believe that this is God's will, and they just wanted to wait for better times, believing that if they concentrate on learning and teaching and abiding by the Jewish law, eventually a better future will await them. A relatively small group, in a way, accepted the idea of the modern anti-Semitism, and said maybe they are right. Maybe we are a different nation, maybe we are a different race, and we don't belong to Europe as such. And we need a homeland, a different homeland outside of Europe. And that led to the emergence of the Zionist movement. As I say, at first, many Jews did not subscribe to Zionism as the best solution, but as the anti-Semitic persecution intensified, and definitely with the rise of Nazism and fascism in the early 1930s, this kind of a solution became more popular. A second impulse for Zionism had to do with the wish to modernize Jewish life, to secularize it, to make it more secular. And when you put the two things together, that creating a national movement for Jews is both a solution for anti-Semitism, but is also a positive idea of making the Jews a modern people, you understand the attractiveness of Zionism, especially to a younger generation of Jews. So far, this impulse the two impulses I described were noble, were positive. They didn't harm anyone. Nobody became a victim because Jews wanted to define Judaism as nationalism, or Jews wanted to modernize their life and society. The problem was that different forces in Europe and within the Jewish communities began to think that the only place where you could satisfy these two impulses, the impulse for modern life as Jews and the impulse for defining Judaism as nationalism, was Palestine. Did they know that there were other people already living in Palestine? Did they know that already at the time that they were thinking about themselves as part of a national movement, already Palestinians were beginning to define themselves in national terms? I think their leaders, their leading activists, knew that they are dealing with a place where other people are living. Not only other people are living, people with different aspirations, different hopes for their own homeland, people who have been there for centuries. There's a famous letter, maybe some of you have heard about it, when the early Zionist leaders sent a delegation to Palestine. The delegation wrote back to the leader of the Zionist movement, in many ways to the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, that in the following words, they said, the bride, that is Palestine, the bride is beautiful, but it is married to another man. So the idea was that, yes, this is a country that could be a homeland, but we have to understand there is someone else there. What gave them the notion that this was a challenge that they could overcome? Namely, how do you turn someone else's homeland to your homeland, especially when you are a foreigner? You're coming from Europe. You do not belong to that homeland. You are not part of that country, and that country's people have their own ambition. To make that a reality, you needed very strong allies. First of all, you also needed the mentality of colonialism. Namely, this is the age, we're talking about the late 19th century, when Europeans felt they had the right to occupy any part of the world, colonize it, make it their own. The challenge was never what would the local people of Africa or Southeast Asia or Latin America have to say about their ambition for them, but the only challenge was, can they secure the new countries for themselves before another European power would take them over. So the British imperialist interest in Palestine was the Zionist best ally. Britain wanted to extend the empire that was already very large, as you know, and it saw an opportunity by aligning itself to this idea that the Jews need a homeland because Judaism is not a religion but a national movement. They saw it as an excuse to demand, in a way, that Palestine would be part of the British Empire. We have to remember, when all these ideas are negotiated and talked about, Palestine is still part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. And as I said, it's full of people who are the Palestinians, who have their own ambitions and own aspirations. But when you have a powerful colonial empire, probably the strongest empire in the world at the time, behind you, then you have a chance to force the idea of a Jewish state on the people of Palestine. Then you can think seriously that you can implement this vision of Palestine as a Jewish state, that you can impose at the heart of the Arab world of a European Jewish state. What also helped the Zionist movement at the time was that very important people in evangelical Christianity, in the Protestant churches, believed that the Jewish arrival in Palestine is part of a divine scheme that eventually would bring to the resurrection of the dead, the beginning of Christ's reign on earth, because Jesus Christ would return, and so on. Part of this eschatological idea that the return of the Jews of Palestine is part of a bigger divine scheme. So between what we would call probably today Christian fundamentalists or Christian Zionists, imperialists in Britain, and some capitalists who believed that a Jewish state could benefit also capitalist investment, for instance, in the wine industry and so on. That was powerful enough to create a very strong lobby that advocated that Palestine would become a Jewish state. What sometimes you need also historical circumstances that help you, and the decision of Turkey in the First World War not to remain neutral, as was suggested to it, but to join Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany against Britain and France in the First World War, turned Palestine into a war field, into a war area in the First World War, and allowed Britain to claim its right to occupy Palestine as part of the military campaigns against an enemy of the alliance of Britain, France, and Russia, and later the United States. But this was an imposition by power, by violence, against the will of the people. We should remember that. Not one Palestinian was consulted about this idea that their homeland would be a Jewish state. More importantly, maybe, it was very clear to the leaders of the Zionist movement, and I think it was very clear to anyone in the world who supported at the time the idea of turning Palestine into a Jewish state, that this would include victimizing the local population, that this could only be fully implemented by dispossessing the local population. So I don't think anybody was surprised that after 30 years of British rule in Palestine, half of the Palestinian population was expelled by the Zionist movement once the British rule came to an end, and before a final decision was made of what should be the future of Palestine. And I think this is an historical lesson that is important for anyone concerned. Although the United Nations, that was definitely the most important body created after the Second World War to make the world a more peaceful place, legitimized the idea of a Jewish state, not all over Palestine, only over half of Palestine. That United Nations did not include, we have to remember that, did not include most of the colonized world. It includes mostly colonizing states, not colonized states. And when years later, after decolonization ended in a way, at least the physical decolonization ended, in the 1970s, the mid-1970s of the last century, and the United Nations this time included all the ex-colonized people, then the United Nations took a very different decision. It defined Zionism as racism, together with the apartheid system in South Africa. The reason was not, as Israel would claim, because this was a new form of anti-Semitism or a new form of anti-Jewishness. No, the reason was that by the time we reached 1975, when the United Nations adopts this resolution that Zionism is racism, there is enough evidence on the ground. What does a Jewish state mean for the Palestinians? It means that they lost half of their population in 1948, that half of their villages were destroyed in 1948, most of their towns were demolished, and that after 1967, they live under military rule that violates every basic human and civil rights that they have. And this knowledge is the one that led to objection, especially in the global South, to the idea of a Jewish state. Not to the idea of the Jews being in Palestine, but to the idea of a Jewish state, because it seemed to many people then, many more today, agree with it, not at the time though, because a Jewish state was an apartheid state, not a democratic state. But of course, there was a very strong propaganda and advocacy machine that I'm sure you are also experiencing in Taiwan, that claims that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that the Palestinians are anti-democratic, that they are terrorists, that they are Islamists, and so on. This is not new. That from the very beginning, you had to define the Palestinians' anti-colonialist resistance to the idea of having an independent state of their own, as everyone else in the Arab world had. You had to define that ambition as terrorism, an anti-Semitic ambition, because otherwise you would have asked yourself, why not actually support the Palestinians, as the world supported the right of so many people in Africa, in Asia, in America, to get rid of colonial rule and gain independence. So why was Palestine not allowed a similar vision? And in order to prevent this from happening, you needed a lot of force, a lot of violence, and an international community, especially an international community in the West, in the northern global north, to actually ignore the reality on the ground and claim that this is a democracy that is being attacked by people who are motivated by political Islamic fundamentalism, by anti-Semitism, and have no right to act in such a way. The problem for Israel is that the Palestinians did not disappear. They remained. And not only they remained, because they remained either in historical Palestine or on the borders of historical Palestine, in refugee communities, in exilic communities, their struggle continued. And when an anti-colonialist struggle continues, the violence of the colonizer becomes even more extreme. So what happened is that in a world that had more access to information than ever before, it was impossible for a lot of people in the world to buy into the idea that what you have here is a Jewish democracy that defends itself against a group of Arabs and Muslims who are anti-Semitic. It did not tally. It did not go together with the reality on the ground, and more people were aware of that reality on the ground. And this had a huge influence on public opinion in many parts of the world. And here comes the next challenge. The governments, especially those governments that in the past enabled in many ways the dispossession of Palestine, the catastrophe of Palestine, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, not only in 48, the ongoing Nakba. That the challenge was that while so many people in their societies began to show solidarity with the Palestinians and accepted their right for self-determination and independence, the governments continue to support Israel in a similar way. And that brought to the fore a gap between what governments are dealing with in terms of moral issues, issues of justice, issues of international law, and what the societies expect them to do. Now, I think what happened in the last 3 years has brought this gap between normal people's understanding what goes on in Palestine, which is not very complicated. You have a country with 8 million Jews, 8 million Palestinians. Alongside, you have another 5 million Palestinian refugees who wish to live. All these Palestinians want to live in a Palestine, a free Palestine, a normal Palestine. Most of them even want a democratic Palestine that is connected to the neighboring Arab states. So for most people, this demand sounds as part of what international law justifies, both in terms of the right for self-determination, the right of people to defend themselves, the right of people to be protected against dispossession, against expulsion, against violation of their basic human rights and civil rights. And every year, whether it is an Israeli human rights organization or an international rights organization, human rights organizations such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, every year the record of the violation of the basic Palestinian rights is getting worse than the one before. The violation become far more extreme, far more spread, far more frequent, and affect a much larger number of Palestinians. And yet the policies of the governments in the world does not change. Then came the Hamas attack on the 7th of October and the Israeli reaction that most academics in the world, most people who are experts on international law, most people who are involved in human rights and civil rights organizations define as a genocide. So the gap is even more serious. You have millions of people in different societies in the world who say we are witnessing a genocide, and our governments continue with the same policy as before. Israel is a democracy. Israel is defending itself. This is not a genocide. This is a reaction to the brutal attack by the Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. But this is something that is not easy to reconcile. For the first time, bodies such as the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, adopted the position of the societies and not of the governments when they examined what happened in Palestine. And the pressure on the governments from their own societies became stronger. Of course, movements such as the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement that existed before the events in Gaza, was already active and gave a lot of ideas for people what their governments can do in order to save the Palestinians from further genocide in the Gaza Strip and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And the governments in some places began to accept some of these demands, but overall, it seems that the international system is made of governments that claim that moral issues that do not concern them directly are not important. Now came a different development, but I think this is all inevitable. This is something that had to happen when these kind of attitudes in the world continue towards the suffering of the Palestinians. Then came the Israeli-American attack on Iran. And before that, we can mention the American attack on Venezuela, the abduction of head of state. And now we have the threat of a similar action in Cuba. If we connect this to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the Chinese threat to Taiwan, if you put this all together, what you see is that there is a huge danger for the collapse of the international system that should protect states from invasions. What really bothers, I think, a lot of people is that this system is only applied to countries which the West regards as its rivals, as its enemies. So, sanctions on Russia after the invasion of the Ukraine, of course. Sanctions on Israel after the genocide of the Palestinians, no. This is not accepted. And this is something that totally undermines the logic, the moral basis of the international system. Now, people would say, who cares? I need people who would defend my country. I don't care what they do. They can be the worst states in the world, but if they will come to my aid with military power, with military knowledge, that is what is important. But it doesn't work that way, because if your allies are as bad, and maybe even worse in some respect, than your enemies, then you are not going to be saved, because this means that there will be a total chaos in international system. this will be a green light to anyone not to fear any international institution, any international law, any international sanction for creating a lawless world. If you are showing right now that international law is universal, applies to everyone, including the project of Zionism that is a European project, including to the West, when you bring to justice the criminals who are also part of the Western colonialism in Africa, when you are acknowledge the criminality of colonialism, not just the criminality of the Islamic State or the criminality of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, if you are willing to say there is a universal perspective on what is independence, what is sovereignty on the one hand, and in a similar way, you insist on the universal value of human rights and civil rights, then you might have a chance of recreating a system that is far more just and far more able not only to deal with invasions in the future, but also with the global challenges such as global warming, migration, and poverty that we can only deal with as a human society in global cooperation. We cannot deal with, one state cannot deal with these issues. And as long as there is an exceptionalism, and Israel is the best example of exceptionalism, as long as there is exceptionalism, it's impossible to have a universal conversation. We can see it in the issue of human rights. Very few people in the Arab world would deny, not only the Arab world, let's talk about West Asia, the Middle East as a whole. People would not deny that there is a problem with human rights and civil rights in Iran, in Arab countries, and so on. Nobody denies it. But if the conversation of how to deal with violations of human rights and civil rights does not include Israel, and it does not include Israel in the last 78 years, then nobody takes seriously this conversation anywhere else. For me, in many ways, the key for beginning a conversation of a world where we have some chance of dealing with the sinister position of military industry, securitization industries, the lack of moral values in international politics. For me, the key begins with Palestine. Because if we are able to reintroduce the moral dimension when we are assessing what's wrong in Israel and Palestine, when we are reassessing the way we, as an international community, totally ignore the Palestinians, their aspirations, their right to be the ones who decide the future of the place. As long as we continue to do this, unless we change this kind of attitudes, it's very difficult to have a different conversation. But once we do recognize these rights, once we accept the basic rights of the Palestinians, we can begin to rebuild a conversation or start a conversation that I think for millions of people in the world would be important, although there are, of course, political elites, military elites, economic elites, who make so much money from a world that doesn't have moral values, that doesn't have moral consideration, that we will face a huge challenge. There's no doubt about it. And with this I would end, I think the big question for me is, the millions of mostly young people who marched in many parts in the world in solidarity with the Palestinians it was very clear that they were not just marching for the rights of the Palestinians, or they were not just calling to end the genocide in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. They were also marching against the injustice in their own societies. And the big question is, and I pose it in many places, will some of these young people in the future be the politicians in positions of power to introduce a different kind of politics, where you could defend your right not to be invaded, but at the same time insist that you are not trading with a genocidal state? A system that says the two are not incompatible. In fact, the two are compatible, they strengthen each other. This is not easy because the media is connected to the political elite is connected to the military industry, and they have their own narrative to make sure that you will see moral values as a weakness, almost suicidal in many cases. I know it from Israel. If I talk about the need for Israel to be a democratic state, people say to me, so you want Israel to commit suicide? And I say, no, I think that if you are not, as a state, going to be properly democratic, you will commit suicide. That's a big debate, but it's not a debate that is won alongside an academic table. For this, you need to wait for developments on the ground that show that you are right. And that's what I hope to do in my last book, Israel on the Brink. And just hope that it's not too late for systems that don't work to collapse in such a terrible way that many people would be affected by it. But I do think we have to believe that this is not complicated, sophisticated, or impossible to simultaneously talk about the rights of people to be independent, the rights of people not to be invaded, and the right of people not to be genocided and ethnically cleansed. And you cannot build alliances between criminals in order to save yourself, because this kind of alliance cannot be trusted, and it also means that you criminalize yourself in a way that maybe the solution to the threat that you are facing is even worse than the threat itself. Sorry, there's an aeroplane here. Just a second. I think I'll stop here anyway, now that a lot of noise in the background. And I'm very happy to take your questions and comments.
非常感谢教授的演讲。其实我们这边还不会听到教授背景的杂音，所以没有关系。等一下教授就是说话是都听得很清楚的。那非常感谢教授，就是非常深入跟就是全面的演讲。那我相信大家应该有非常非常多的问题，我自己也有很多的一些问题和想法。那但是今天时间宝贵的话，我就希望可以把这个时间留给现场的朋友们。那已经看到有些人举手了。Hank， 你要不要就是可以打开麦克风跟那个镜头，然后直接问教授问题呢
OK， 没有问题，我可以就是麦克风就这样。
好，可以，
对，那我问题也可以就是在英文里面讲述，可以吗？
也可以，如果你要直接英文也可以。
Okay, that's perfect then. Yeah. So my question is that, as many of you probably notice, in North American and European political spheres, anti-Semitism is still being widely discussed right now. While I generally agree with the importance of acknowledging its atrocity, especially committed by Nazi Germany and Europe at large throughout the entire history against Jewish people, I think the discussion about anti-Semitism is still focused on Jewish people, and it's to me, it's a little bit tone deaf with an ongoing active genocide happening against Palestinian people. And additionally, systematically, Jewish people as an ethnicity receive a lot of institutional resources and benefits in contrast to the never-ending systematic oppressions against those of the indigenous and Black populations who experience chattel slavery and settler colonialism historically. So I think in a way to phrase anti-Semitism and Jewish oppression as equivalent to those experienced by people of color in the global South, it's rather a deceitful discourse, if you will. So I think my question to you, Professor, is how to navigate this public discourse with politicians, especially politicians, political representatives, medias, or even friends and families, emphasizing the importance of reshifting this institutional focus on anti-Semitism that benefits and legitimizes settler colonialism at large to focus on Palestinian experiences. And just to add on to that, I think this is very important because it also sets aside from the same of the new conservative and white supremacy movements, such as those represented by the likes of Tucker Carlson, who has actual anti-Semitic intention. So I think that's my question.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think you're right. I think that creating a hierarchy of racism is wrong. All racism should be banned, should be challenged, should be unacceptable. And if you try to claim that there's anti-Semitism, which is different from a racism against other groups in the past or in the present, I think it is wrong. In fact, I think it contributes to more racism towards the Jews, this wish to be exclusive victim, or a victim that is victimized in a more terrible way than anyone else. Not easy to fight it, I agree, because there's a huge investment in money and effort and advocacy to try and single out anti-Semitism as the worst kind of racism. This is the legacy of the age of imperialism, where, of course, racism towards non-European people was totally legitimized. Yes, there was a sense that this was over. In fact, my claim is that because Europe dealt in the wrong way with racism towards Jews by supporting Zionism rather than building a society which is dealing with racism as a whole as a problem, because they didn't do that. Racism came back to Europe, not against Jews, but against Muslims mainly, but not only against Muslims. So it's a human condition, it's a human attitude, which can be directed by anyone against anyone. And the only way of probably challenging it, as I say, is not very easy, is to ask for time and space to discuss with people three important items. One is the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It already downsizes the whole problem of anti-Semitism if people would see that criticizing Israel, criticizing the genocide, criticizing the ethnic cleansing is not anti-Semitism. And I think Israel weaponizes Israel and its allies weaponize anti-Semitism in order to provide immunity to its own actions. And it's something quite surprising that very educated, knowledgeable people in the West accept this baseless equation between criticism on ideology that seems to many people to be a racist ideology that informs violence and acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and the hatred of people because of their faith. So that's one point which I think we should insist on having space and time to explain. Secondly, we need to take out this idea that a certain genocide is worse than any other genocide. Not easy, but we cannot let the genocide of the African slaves be taken to a more marginal position in our global memory, or making the Germans the worst kind of people because of the Holocaust. Universalizing the genocide of the Jews is the best antidote against future genocides. Singling out the Germans as the worst kind of genocide that did very little to stop genocide around the world. And thirdly, we should insist that the people who need our attention, the people who need our defense, are the Palestinians who are being genocided right now. And shift the conversation, disrupt the narrative that does not allow us to focus on this. So I think this is something that is very important. As for Carl, what you mentioned about some anti-Semites who one day are pro-Israelis, then the other way they're pro-Palestinians, I think this is less important. This is a noise that we should not be distracted by. We should really focus on the weaponization of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial that provides immunity to a genocide on the ground. Somehow we should get to people with this. This is not a sophisticated, not a complicated reality. It is, we are in the age when this is televised. This cannot be ignored. And people ignore it not because they don't know. They ignore it because they have other interests. And we should question these interests and their moral validity.
Thank you.
谢谢教授的回答，非常的强调出就是平等的重要性，没有一场种族灭绝是比其他更重要，每一场都是必须要被好好重视的。那我们下一个问题是来自比拉蔡，你要不要就是也直接问问题呢
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor, for your lecture here. And a bit of introduction here. I study Arabic in the university currently, and I have a double major in diplomacy. So I'm probably the one that you mentioned, that pro-Palestinians that when they're in power in the future, whether they will betray their original moral beliefs or not. I will try to do my best here. And my question here is, like, I'm pretty sure a lot of people here would like to ask. Like, Taiwan is long excluded in the international system, including like international law and so on. And when I participate in some sort of pro-Palestinian movements, I notice that a lot of my peers which are educated in international relations, they tend to see these whole thing, like the genocide in Gaza, with a view of realpolitik as a pretext of Taiwanese support for Israel. And my question here is just, don't we really have any leverage towards Israel? And in your view, what should Taiwan really do? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, some countries in the world have a very strong leverage. Europe is Israel's most important trading partner, and if it would have imposed half of the sanction it imposes on Russia on Israel, it would save the life of thousands of Palestinians. I think that the Taiwanese cooperation on cybersecurity, on semiconductors, AI, on that level, and in the Taiwanese investment, as you know, even in the occupied West Bank, if they would be questioned, if they would be withdrawn or even if there will be a threat of them to be withdrawn because Taiwan doesn't want to stand indifferent in the face of a genocide, it will have an impact. It will have an impact on the Israeli international standing, on the Israeli economy, on the Israeli military machine. I'm not saying that this by itself would have drastic approach, but we know from the history of South Africa, you have a domino effect where country after country are joining, and regardless of their actual objective contribution, the fact that they are part of a process by which the international community says this is not acceptable and there's a price attached to this. And this is not done through violence, but through non-violence means, such as sanctions, or the threat of sanctions. You have to remember that any such development, even if it's a minor development, is something that eventually would become a powerful transformative process. And I say it because of history, because that's how it worked in history. The ability of the international community to stop crimes against humanity is very much like a kind of a stream down the hill where the first flow is not very strong, but it gathers momentum and strength as it goes down when it becomes steeper and steeper. And we are not yet seeing an acceleration in the ability of the international community to deal with Israel, but it's a different world from the one that was 20 years ago. It's not enough for the people of Gaza and the West Bank right now because it's not powerful enough. But, if I can give you one example, it was very clear that the Gulf states' wish to normalize relationship with Israel has nothing to do with moral positions or about solidarity or no solidarity with the Palestinians. It had to do with petrodollars. It had to do with economic viability. It had to do with what they believed was a defense against Iranian ambition. I'm not sure how many of them think that this was the right approach now, after everything that happened. They will have to rethink. Now, they won't rethink because suddenly they will feel the solidarity that many of their own people feel, but because this is the kind of lawlessness that I think people did not realize in positions of power that the unconditional support to Israel is bringing to the international system. And therefore, I come back to my point that Israel and America, who are free to do what they want, are turning the world into a place where people are free to do what they want. States are free what to do. Regimes are free to do what they want. Neither people in Taiwan nor people in Cuba want to live in such a world. None of us, in fact, should be willing to live in such a lawless world. And if you want an international law, you need a consensual international law. And if there are exceptions, then everything is exception. So the exception becomes the rule, and that is very, very dangerous. Very, very dangerous.
Thank you.
It's also
Thank you.
那我们下一个问题的话是来自 Dana 要不要也是直接开讯号直接问教授呢？
Hello. So first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm a little nervous, but thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. So basically, I'm here because, well, I was born and raised in France, but I'm originally from Syria. And this country is very interesting because it has been attacked by Russia, the Syrian army, and the Iran army, but also by Israel. So I feel like only Syrian can understand how much it is important that all the peoples are free and independent, no matter where their oppressor is from. And right now we are a year away from the French presidential elections, and it happens that many parties are very supportive of the Taiwanese independence, but they won't say this much about Palestine. And only one party is fully publicly supportive of Palestine, but won't talk about the invasion of Ukraine or the Chinese threat on Taiwan. And in my ideal world, I would like all these oppressed countries to be completely free and independent. But I feel like I will have to kind of sacrifice at least one people whenever I give my vote, because I didn't find a party that supports every oppressed peoples, and it's honestly terrifying. So do you think we could bring back that idea that all the genocides in the world, no matter if it's Ukraine or Palestine, is equally dramatic and important? So that's my question.
Yes, well, as I said, Dana, before, I think that we are living in an international system that was defined by the West after the Second World War. The wish was, of course, not to have a third world war. The wish was to deal with the terrible crimes that were committed mainly on European soil, like Nazism and fascism. Very little was said about the crimes of the West in the rest of the world. Only in 1960, the international legal system was willing to consider colonialism as a crime against humanity, but not settler colonialism, not projects like Canada, the United States, Australia, or Israel. So this system was built on assumptions which are not all relevant anymore. And because of that, it doesn't work. And you can see that this is a two-tier system. It has one system for the West and one system to the rest of the world in terms of what is just and what is not just, what is a violation and not a violation. And this does not enable us to have the kind of system that you are talking about. But we should, it's our world as much as it is the world of the politicians and the people who run the industries, the multinational corporation, and so on. And the question is, do we have the ability to insist of redefining that system so that it would be inclusive, that it would be just? What I'm trying to say here is that sometimes you cannot do it all over the world, but Palestine is a good place to begin with because it's the most striking example of how hypocritical and double-faced or double standard is the system. So that's why I think we all have such hopes for that on the one hand, and that's why we are so depressed by our so far inability to do it. It's similar to in the 1970s when liberation movement created new states after centuries or sometimes decades of colonialism. There was a bit of a disappointment. Not all the post-colonial states were good places in terms of human rights and civil rights and so on. And Palestine was never decolonized, was never liberated. So people said, oh, Palestine will be different from Syria, it will be different from Iraq, it will be different, because they hoped that this would be a country which would learn from the mistakes of others. I still have this hope. I think it's a valid point, but we need that to happen and to see whether we are right, that this could be a push for dramatic change in the region, but also in the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
谢谢教授。那我们下一位的话是段义明先生，那他有就是在讯息里面留言，但是我也有看到举手，要不要直接开麦克风直接问教授呢？如果不方便的话，那我这边也可以解释一下，就是段一鸣先生的问题，主要是关于那个哈马斯在2023年的这一个洪水行动，那他这场行动的结果就是有什么样的影响呢？那有哪一些负面跟正面的影响？那我们确实也看到，就是巴勒斯坦的这一些部分的这些战士们，就是去屠杀以色列的人民们。那这样子的一个事情，我们要怎么样去理解？尤其是这样子一个状态，它确实也是让两边就是有更多的仇恨而产生。
Was it supposed to be a translation to what you said? Because I didn't hear a translation. I only heard you.
Okay, let me just read it out loud.
So I didn't understand what
he wrote the question actually. So he wrote the question: How should we view Hamas Operation Flood in 2023? Did it have any positive effects at all? If so, were the downsides greater?
Oh, I see it now.
And how should we view some Palestinian groups slaughter of Israeli citizens? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Mina, I see the question now. Sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah. Well, it's I'm not sure the term positive or negative are the right terms to do it. We're getting into the realm of moral judgments, and this is far more, I think, problematic, because as much as I support the Palestinian right for self-determination, for self-defense, and so on, I do not condone everything that Hamas did on the 7th of October, and much of it is a violation of or is a war crime, of course not at the same level as Israel, but this is part of the problem when you look at the symptoms of the violence and not the origin of the violence. So for me, October the 7th is a symptom of the violence. It's not the reason that there is a violence reality in Israel and Palestine. So I would see it rather in two ways. One is maybe more focused on the second part of your question: how should we view the slaughter of Israeli civilians, as you put it in your question? In that context, of course, first of all, we should apply our international legal perspective on war crimes to everyone. Secondly, we should understand the connection between violations of civil rights and human rights, or the unjustified killing by an anti-colonialist movement, and the validity of the anti-colonialist movement itself. I'll give you an example. In July 1962, the FLN, the anti-colonialist Algerian liberation movement, some members of that movement slaughtered French settlers' families in a terrible act of violence. This did not invalidate the right of the Algerians to demand independence. And if you want to prevent such actions, you have to go to the source of the violence. So you have a context by which you understand, not justified, by which you understand a certain level of brutality and inhumanity, and you think of how best to challenge it in the future. So that's one way of dealing with it. The other one is maybe more concretely, we still don't have all the evidence of what really happened. This is not trying to absolve the Hamas from acts of murder and so on, but we don't have a full picture on that. The role of the Israeli army, in Israel itself, there are suspicions about the delay in the army response and so on. So I think we need some time to wait to have a fuller picture. But there's no doubt about it. An anti-colonialist struggle, a process of decolonization, is not a peaceful process. Now, if you want to make it a peaceful process, you have to accelerate it. You have to offer alternative, non-violent means, and then you can hope for a transformation from occupation, ethnic cleansing, and genocide to peace. We have a very good example in the case of the Palestinians. The best way to try and reduce the need to use violence, or the urge to use violence even, against ethnic cleansing, occupation, and all the suffering that Palestinians were experiencing in the last nearly 60 years of occupation, and even more so if you go back to the Nakba of 1948. If you want to offer a way forward, then you have to offer an effective way of ending that oppression. If you don't offer an effective way of ending the oppression, what do you expect the oppressed people to do? What would you do if on a daily basis members of your family would be killed, imprisoned without trial? Your house might be demolished, you might be expelled, you're at the mercy of Israeli soldiers and Secret Service agencies. You need to have a horizon, a future, and to make sure that there is a way forward that does not allow more extreme people to take over and more extreme means to be regarded as the only way forward. I really say this now as an historian. The basic impulse of the Palestinians from the very beginning of the encounter with the Zionist movement was to have normal life, not revenge, not retribution. Any one of you who know Palestinians would know that what they really want is just have a normal life, not ideal life. Normal life is not ideal. It's full of problems. But they fight for their own existence, and they want the normal life. If you allow them normal life, you will have very little room, I think, and very little hope for anyone who would try to continue with violence to change the reality. But if you don't allow this kind of normal life to develop, you are pushing people to the wall, and you are not going to see people willing to be treated in such a way without any response.
Thank you so much, Ilan. I think I will speak English then, because then in this case, Yangang can stay in one channel and we don't have to switch channels.
Good.
Just by the way, on this point, thank you for mentioning the case of Algeria. And just to share a little bit like Taiwanese history, actually, there are also cases that because Taiwan was colonized by Japan for 50 years. So, of course, if we study history, there were also numerous cases that they were actually quite violent because Taiwanese and indigenous were trying to oppose and resist the colonization. Okay, and if I may also, Professor, if you can make the answer shorter, because we actually do have quite a lot of questions.
Oh, I don't. Maybe we won't be able to put them all because
Yeah, yeah,
I would have to
yeah.
leave you in 12 minutes, I'm afraid.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the next one, yeah, we have one that so Ivan, do you want? Sorry, 1 second. Right, Ivan, do you want to speak? Okay, maybe while we wait, I don't know, I'm not sure if Ivan heard me. There's another one written question. There's more expansion nowadays. By, for example, the Americans' war on Iran and entering Lebanon. Based on your own research, what does Israelis' internal societies and publics looking at all this continuation of war?
Yeah, thank you. And I do apologize if we won't get everyone in. Mina, I promise to come back. We can have another session very soon, okay? So people should not feel let down because not everyone will be answered. I will come back. Unfortunately, I think the vast majority of the Jewish electorate in Israel supported the genocide. 93% supported the genocide. We don't have full figures for the war on Iran and so on, but the support is very high. And I think that is something from the outside that is not always fully understood. There is opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, to some of his domestic actions regarding the judicial reform that he wants. There is secular Jews who are not happy with the way this current coalition wants to make Israel more theocratic. But there's very little objection to the policies towards the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Iranians, and so on. So I think that's the main problem. The reason we are talking about sanction and pressure and the possibility of Taiwan playing a more positive role than it plays right now is there are no dynamics of change within the Israeli Jewish society. And when there are no dynamic of change from the inside, you need the pressure from the outside. Effective pressure from the outside can also create more dynamics of change from the inside. So I think that most of the Israeli Jewish society listens to the same media outlets, and they have a very clear narrative that very much agrees with the government, that all the Israeli actions are self-defense, that this is a war for national survival against Iran's wish to destroy Israel, and the Hamas is a proxy of Iran, and so is Hezbollah. No mentioning whatsoever of the occupation, the oppression, the siege on Gaza, the ethnic cleansing. This is not at all brought up as possible factors that have to be considered in order to understand why we are going from one cycle of violence to the other.
Thank you so much, Ilan. The next question is more around one state. So there are questions around how one state solution can protect Israel Jews, their rights not to be violated, and also what the one state solution in the end becomes the majority's Arab peoples and actually oppressing the minority of Jews. How do we envision that one state? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, the whole idea of a one democratic state is that under a true democracy, it doesn't matter whether you're an Arab or a Jew. That's the whole idea. The whole idea is that your religious identity, your ethnic identity, does not determine your civic rights, which is the situation in Israel. So, of course, the idea is to build a democratic state for everyone, whether they are Jews, Muslims, or Christians. And I think this is not about maintaining the Jewish community as a Zionist community, namely a community that believes that it has a right for the homeland of the Palestinians, but rather a group of people who have a different faith, maybe have a different culture, maybe are an ethno-cultural group that needs to be protected for its collective rights. In the work that Palestinians and other scholars are doing, and there's quite a lot of work on envisaging the one state, there is a discussion of how to protect collective identities, not only of Jews, the other, especially that part of the world, the West Asia, is a mosaic of groups and identities. And people, unlike many parts of the world maybe, feel very strong affiliation to groups on an ethnic basis, cultural basis, religious basis. So the whole area needs to rebuild the political system that on the one hand respects this mosaic of identities, including, if you want, the Hebrew Jewish identity, and protects the individual rights. But in order to build such a society, you first have to decolonize. You have to end apartheid. You have to dismantle institutions that discriminate. You have to end policies of dispossession. And then you have to build it. Now, it won't be easy to build it. And I think, unfortunately, as happened with white people in South Africa, quite a lot of Jews, if ever Palestine became a democracy, would say, we don't want to live in a state which is not an apartheid Jewish state. We don't feel secure. That happened to white people in South Africa. They left South Africa. Some of them came to the West Bank because the West Bank is an apartheid system. A lot of Jews, I don't know if you know it, but Jews from South Africa came to the West Bank, those who thought that apartheid was morally right, and continue it in the West Bank. So this is something that the Palestinians would have to deal with, engage with. I don't think it's very high, and rightly so, on their priority list, but definitely they will have to offer and tell the Jews who would be willing to live in a democracy and not in apartheid, what kind of collective rights will they have in such a place. My guess is that because of the heritage and the history of the place, this is not a unique case. This is not a unique case. You have so many groups that have their very strong group identity, and in a way, the modern Arab nation state had destroyed this mosaic as much as did imperialism and Zionism. So building a new Palestine is connected to building a new Eastern Mediterranean, what we call in Arabic the Mashriq. We need to rebuild this anyway, because there are so many groups that feel threatened by the nation state, threatened by each other, and so on. But you cannot disconnect the Palestine issue from its organic region.
Thank you so much for the answer. And it's really shocking to hear actually there were white South Africans moved to just because of they want to continue the apartheid process. We have Ivan and Aurora raising their hands. Yvonne, would you like to speak directly? Unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you help me translate my question in English? Because I have to ask my question in Chinese.
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
就是我想说，那个我曾经在 Threads 上面也跟那个台湾的一位县议员辩论巴勒斯坦的议题，然后他就是一个 Zionist， 对，他就是一个 Zionist， 一直在那边诡辩，然后我在那边跟他辩很久，我就觉得我烧掉很多脑细胞，就从这边看得出来，还是就是台湾这方面还是很多人还是亲以色列的。你要是讲到巴勒斯坦议题的话，他们就会说哦，你是哈马斯，你是亲哈马斯，你是那个 他们是 terrorist， 你怎么可以还是挺他们什么的？每次讲到这方面，我真的很头痛，就不知道说要跟他们怎么讲。
我让问题简短一点哦，剩下最后几分钟。
哦，对不起。对，我的问题差不多就是这样，就是反映我的经验而已，这样子。对，我的问题就是这样。对。
Professor, did you understand that?
No.
I think it's meant just to express the shocking feeling of the Taiwanese general attitudes, even politicians and their attitude towards Palestine and Israel, because they tend to have a very simplified view. Okay, maybe I would ask Aurora, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Mina and Lala and all of my other comrades for organizing, and for Dr. Pappé. The talk was great. My question is kind of theoretical, but I wanted to know what you think about how we can engage with the current liberal capitalist international order to try to, material change things, to end the genocide in Palestine through invocations of international law and, recognition politics, recognition of sovereignty and statehood, or provision of humanitarian aid through the UN. How do we engage with all of that without actually reifying the structures of the international order that make it like this in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, because what another way of looking at what you ask is redefining, I think, in a way, a role for the left in leading us in challenging the capitalist system, because that's the only ideology in the past that really has put a counter argument to the capitalist liberal system. And that is a complicated process, because nowadays also the left needs some soul searching. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into it too long. Hopefully there will be another opportunity to talk to you, all of you. But there needs to be a soul searching kind of idea, and I'll tell you where I'm going with it. The coalition that maintains the kind of politics that we have today, devoid of moral values, self-centered politicians, where capital plays such an important role in determining political decisions. Even invasion of countries have a lot to do with capitalist interests, as we have seen in the case of Venezuela and even in Iran, in order to deal, it's such a powerful coalition that if we want to create a counter coalition, we have to remember that people who can be part of that coalition do not necessarily share everything in terms of their, for example, their attitude towards tradition, religion, and so on. We need to find a dialogical way of replicating what we were able to do in demonstrations. We could get 1 million people in Rome or London to demonstrate for Palestine, even if they came from different communities, different value systems, and so on. We have to find a way to create this as a political force. And for that, we need to be pragmatic. We need to be less purist. But we need to rethink attitudes that sometimes the classical left had towards tradition and religion and so on, because this is very dear to many people. I'm not talking about the politicized form of tradition and religion. I'm talking about its role in people's life, whether it's spiritual, whether it's traditional, whether it's religious, it doesn't matter. It has to be respected. And I think that can create a very powerful counter coalition, because there are many shared values in this kind of attitude between the left and people who were oppressed as minorities, and part of the oppression was violation of their tradition and religion, is that the sense of justice for a certain faith, a certain way of life, is usually connected also to the well-being of people, the material well-being of people, and their mental and their psychological well-being. And I think this is where, suddenly we saw the connection between the Palestinians and indigenous people in Canada or in Mexico. Suddenly, although two different societies, two different historical incidents, if you want, two different kinds of oppression, and yet there was a strong sense of solidarity, that they are facing a similar inability to live the normal life the way they want to live it. Now, this is a huge challenge, but this is the challenge that would allow us also to gain from the human capital that these societies are bringing with them, about the world, about ecosystems, about all kinds of knowledge that is not all learned in Western universities. I don't have to tell you this in Taiwan. There is this human heritage that should not be divided, should be wholesome for the benefit of humanity. And I think that requires from those who were fighting, rightly so, capitalism and neoliberalism, also to understand that not to adopt a very narrow secular position. And I think this could be a basis for the future. Mina, I'm willing to take another question, and then I'm sorry I have another
I think the
obligation.
final.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. The final question, I think, from Kiyohira. They wrote a question in the chat box, but also raised a hand.
In English or Chinese?
Would you like to unmute yourself and say your question directly?
Oh, I see it. Is this, yeah, I can read the question in English. Okay. As a student in the medical field, there are many colleagues who are hesitant for BDS in a way related to their professions because of the idea that humanitarian medical care is something that transcends racism and geopolitics. How should we, as activists, come to terms with this viewpoint? Yes, that is an important question. I agree. But unfortunately, we need to take a comprehensive view about medical help or humanitarian aid as well, because we cannot depoliticize it as much as maybe we would have liked to depoliticize it. I can give 3 very quick examples on it. The medical establishment in Israel, willingly or unwillingly, intentionally or unintentionally, is involved also in the oppression. You cannot torture people without having a doctor on call. You don't have a prison system that is so barbaric without having medical staff attached to it. You don't have a military that dispossesses without a medical unit in it. So you cannot dislodge the medical profession from the institution in which they work. So that's one thing. Secondly, I don't think BDS is going to prevent humanitarian help from the Palestinians. What it makes sure, and I think this is understandable, that humanitarian aid is not used as a measure of pressure on the Palestinians to accept a continued oppression. You have to be very much aware of how the Americans used humanitarian aid, that is the Trump administration, to create this terrible idea that you have a center in Gaza, that only if Israel approves you as a Palestinian, you can get the humanitarian aid. This is a very cynical abuse of humanitarian aid. So I think you need to study very well what is the humanitarian aid consist of, what are the terms attached to it, and ask why Israel does not allow a very conventional stream of humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip, in the same way that it doesn't allow one journalist to go into the Gaza Strip. You know, this is what I think. So activists should explain to people that you cannot gaslight, the situation by claiming that you're only dealing with humanitarian issues. No, they are connected. They are part of the tools, the kit of tools used to immunize criminal activity, to put pressure on people. And I think that this is something that is very important to make sure that we are not misled here, to believe that by preventing pressure on Israel, we will enable the Palestinians to have a better humanitarian aid. In fact, the opposite is correct.